Okay, well, thank you, David, and thank you very much for the invitation to give this talk. So the title is up there, I won't repeat it. Anyone recognize this submarine canyon? It's an easy one. Just shout out if you do. I know David does, surely. Okay, there's a much harder one later. That was well set up. Yeah. So this talk, my background is in deep marine sedimentology and stratigraphy. And a lot of that work I'm just interested in sedimentary systems, but a lot of that work has very clear applications to things like oil and gas and CCS and beyond. My real interest is process sedimentology, so my background is in field geology and flume tank experiments to try to better understand deep marine systems. And we do that sort of work because these systems are, they're below the sea surface, they're often very deep, kilometers deep, they're inaccessible, difficult to get to, difficult to monitor, difficult to observe. So that's why we do flume tank experiments, that's why we do a lot of outcrop sedimentology. But that's where my interest comes from. It's really understanding how grain scale processes can build entire deep marine depositional systems. So just a quick acknowledgement, this work, working with anthropogenic pollutants, in particular microplastics that I'll talk about, has opened up lots of new collaborations with people that I otherwise wouldn't have probably worked with, so biologists, chemists, and so on. And really just to highlight this NEOPA at the top, there's a new lab that we're building in Manchester that I direct with my colleague Holly Shields. And this is designed to sort of span the disciplines of biology, chemistry, materials engineering, all sorts of things as a one-stop shop for organic pollutants, including microplastics. So a lot of this work is under the umbrella of this new lab. So, without further ado, welcome to the dustbinian. So, the dustbinian is a term coined by Arger in his seminal book, and it really refers to a time when we start to see the influence of anthropogenic behavior preserved in the sedimentary record and potentially ultimately in the rock record. So, there's been a lot of work obviously done on sedimentology over the years, and there's been some work that's looked at the impact of anthropogenic behavior on sedimentary systems. I'm just highlighting this work by Douglas in 1985, showing the ways that anthropogenic systems, so in this case roads, runoff from roads, runoff from parking lots into rivers, can impact how they behave. But particularly because there's a great quote in this paper, perhaps the stratigraphers of the future will be able to subdivide the upper dustbinian on the basis of the successive appearance of bakelite, plastic, polythene, polyurethane, and so on. In fact, that probably makes me a stratigrapher of the future, because that's what we're doing now. We're starting to try to understand this sedimentary record. Another great thing that I became aware of through the Arger book is that the French Geological Survey used these terms for mapping unconsolidated sediment. So they had the Pubelian inferior, sans plastique, and the Pubelian superior, all plastique. So sand with, or sediment with plastic or without plastic. Just as an informal division, and a bit of fun, I think. So, where I'm coming at this from is many anthropogenic pollutants behave like natural particles do in the environment. So, particles of similar density, similar shape, and so on, we can anticipate that anthropogenic particles might behave in a sort of similar way, and that means that they can be transported by natural processes that we're familiar with, whether that's wind, deposited by rain, carried in clouds, moved by turbidity currents, and so on. And so it's important to say here that I'm going to talk about some specific types of pollutants, and pollutants, by definition, are hazardous to life, or can be detrimental to life, but they can also act as vectors, and in particular I'm going to talk about how microplastics on their own are an environmental contaminant, but they become a multi-stressor when they're combined with other types of pollutants. So some cool work that was done in the past, and is sort of, I think the anthropogenic angle was sort of incidental to these studies. This is from a paper by Hay from up in Rupert Inlet, British Columbia. That's right, isn't it? Yeah. And this is a seafloor channel. It's actually a fjord. So this is a cross-section through, this is the seabed here. These are levees on a channel, so flanking a channel. That's the channel in the center. And this is at the outer bend of a channel, with this being the outer bend, this being the inner bend. And what you see is this overspill of flow onto the levee. That's why the levee is higher on that side, because it's the outer bend of the channel. Everything's spilling over the edge. But that flow is actually copper tailings from a mine. It's not a natural flow, but it's these tailings from the mine have built a geometry that we're very familiar with from the seafloor, from the modern seafloor. But this is built largely by these anthropogenic pollutants. Another well-known event was this is Nice in the south of France, Nice airport. This is the river Var here. This is the coastline. This is the Var submarine canyon going down to about a kilometre water depth here. And in 1979, they were building out the runway at Nice airport, up here, building an extension. And that extension failed, and it collapsed down the continental shelf, which is very narrow here, down the steep continental slope. And actually, all of that material tumbled down into the Var Canyon as a turbidity current and debris flow went further out to sea, and that included things like diggers, buildings, all sorts of machinery, a huge sediment gravity flow. And that stuff actually went down to well over a kilometre water depth as a big turbidity current and probably a debris flow. One of the things that I found that really sort of drove my research was there's quite a few studies on pollutants in the deep sea. Barely any of them consider the processes by which they got there, particularly in the case of particulates. So, for example, when I started the work I'll present shortly, there's studies of microplastics in the deep sea, and they sort of went to the Atlantic or the Pacific and said, there's 10 microplastics here, there's 30 microplastics here. And I was thinking, so what? It doesn't really mean very much unless you have contextual information. So what's the grain size? What's the depositional environment? What are the currents doing there? Because otherwise it's like stamp collecting. It's interesting to know that they're there, but you can't do anything with that information. And I'll come back to that. Right, so the first part of this talk, I'm going to talk through some microplastic research that we've done. Microplastics are small plastics, different definitions, it doesn't really matter. But two definitions usually used: particles below 5 or 1 millimetre along their longest axis. I use 1 millimetre because it makes sense to me as micro, but it doesn't matter. I've given up that battle. But they're small plastics, and they can be fragments, they can be fibres, and they can be primary or manufactured. This includes things like microbeads used in cosmetics or for stripping paint off cars or planes or whatever. They can be secondary, so derived from breakdown of larger plastics that are broken down mechanically or through UV degradation, and fibres from synthetic textiles and films and various other types of plastics. There's lots of them. How much is out there? Well, we know plastic's ubiquitous in modern life. If you look around this room, it's difficult to see anything that's not touched by plastic, formed by plastic, has plastic in it somewhere. So the chairs, the carpet, probably the varnish, the lights, the screen, it's all plastic. There's a lot of it. Don't need to tell you that, really. And production has increased exponentially since the 1950s. These are some older papers, but currently estimated as 450 million tonnes plastic produced every year. So that's quite a lot. Another slightly old estimate, but the current estimate is around 9.7 billion tonnes of plastic has been produced over the last 65 years. So yeah, plastic has been mass produced really since the 1950s, and it's increasing exponentially. Lots of that is now waste. Waste in itself isn't a problem because waste can be utilised to make energy. It can be recycled, but a lot of that waste isn't managed effectively, and that's where the problem arises. So yeah, some bigger numbers. So between 4.8 and 12.7 million tonnes of plastic entered the Earth's oceans in 2010. I couldn't find a more up-to-date reference to verify whether that's risen by an order of magnitude, but it's a lot. And at least 5.25 trillion pieces of plastic are estimated to be afloat in the world's oceans. And that's interesting because most estimates suggest that only 1% of the oceanic plastic is on the surface or floating. The other 99% is on the seabed or on its way to the seabed. And what's the problem with plastic? So we all use plastic every day. We drink from plastic, we consume we breathe microplastics. Plastics by themselves are relatively inert. They do cause various problems that biologists are starting to understand in terms of toxicology and various other aspects. But they don't operate in isolation. So one of the main problems is microplastics. Plastic usually has a very rough surface, area. So very small particles can have very large surface areas compared to natural counterparts. One of the key things is that they're really long-lived. So if you think about a lightweight plastic particle and think about a natural analog to that, you might think of like a bit of a twig or a leaf or something like that. They don't last very long in the environment, whereas plastic does. So plastic can float around, it can accumulate material on its surface, and they can become quite toxic through that, depending on what they pass through in their lifespan. So we might have 65-year-old plastics floating around in the sea that have been accumulating toxins, heavy metals, all sorts of stuff. They might have been eaten by several organisms that have died. They persist a really long time. So it's not just the plastics in isolation. They're consumed throughout the trophic web, and they biomagnify through the trophic web. So the smallest things eat them, or they become absorbed into their flesh, translocation, and they biomagnify through the food chain up to the apex predators, things like mackerel and sharks and us. Their impact is still really poorly understood. This is if you look up microplastic research or you follow these things in journals, there's hundreds, maybe thousands of papers every day. It's impossible to keep up. Importantly, I think we don't know where plastics are or how they got there. That's a big gap to me. So a hypothesis would be the flows that are carrying microplastics are the same flows that are carrying nutrients and oxygen to things that live on the seafloor. So it's important to understand this. We don't know how long they'll stay there. So a lot of the early research I read said, the particles go out to sea, then they settle into the sediment, and then that's it. But we know that isn't the end of the story for sediment. If you deposit plastics in a submarine canyon, they're probably not going to stay there forever. They'll be remobilized and carried back into the system. And I would say without earth sciences, you're really missing a major part of the understanding, because without the process understanding, you can't predict where things are. You can't compare results through time. So if you want to monitor mitigation efforts, for example, you need to understand the sites you've chosen, that they are sensible sites, that they're comparable, and so on. So it's really, I think it's the absolute basic sort of stuff that we should know, but you might be surprised when you look in the literature, a lot of this stuff is missing. Oh, and some pictures of some things that have been affected by plastics. This is a sea pen, sea cucumber. There's a really cool study on hermit crabs that showed that hermit crabs in a tank that were exposed to microplastics picked different types of shells to those that weren't. And this looked like quite a repeatable result, but they do all sorts of things that affect reproductive behavior, have various sorts of toxicity that affect cardiovascular systems, growth of cancer cells, and all sorts of nasty things. So anyway, one of the things that triggered my interest in this was a paper by a colleague. It's Jamie Woodward's research group in the University of Manchester and his student, Rebecca Hurley. And she worked on a river system in the north of England. So this is a river system in blue. It's a tributary system. There's a range of hills here called the Pennines. Manchester's down here. And this river system, this tributary system, becomes the River Mersey, which flows from Manchester to Liverpool and out to the Irish Sea. And what's plotted on here, this is the same map. At the top, we have microplastic particles. On the bottom, microbeads. And what they did in this study was they actually sampled the riverbed, the subaqueous riverbed, so not just the banks of the river. They had this sort of cylindrical device that they pushed into the sediment to isolate it from the flow, sampled the bed by agitating the bed, and counted the number of plastics that were in there. So they did the study and they found lots of plastics. Then they went back after a big flood and they found that, hey presto, a lot of those plastics had moved downstream. It's intuitive that would happen, but I was quite struck by one of the conclusions in the paper, and then they're washed out to sea. And the conclusion was that floods are effective at cleaning river systems. And of course, I thought, what about the sea? And at the same time, there's this sort of model existed, the so-called plastic cycle. And this cycle shows how urban and industrial plastics, which are shed into rivers, some of that might be recycled through wastewater treatment and so on. But you've got this sort of small-scale cycle in here. But then you've got this big arrow that goes out to sea that says oceanic plastic. And ultimately, everything, or a lot of that material, will make its way out to sea. So it's not a cycle at all. It's a little bit of recirculation, and then everything goes out to sea. Simple. And this bit, you'll see, is entirely missing. But it's not the end of the story. So this is the paper from a submarine canyon in the South China Sea. And this is a submarine canyon. These contours are meters, so we're about 2 kilometers water depth. Canyon coming down here. And there's some topography in this canyon, a series of sort of hollows. And these photos show the waste deposited down here at 2 kilometers water depth. And this is stacked up, it's imbricated, like you'd see with plant fragments or tree trunks and things like that in a natural system. But this is waste. And it's pretty disgusting, but it's far from unique. Lots of submarine canyons look similar to this below the surface. You see things like cars, televisions, all sorts in these things. So it's not the end of the story. So submarine canyons as pollutant pathways, I'm aware you're probably not all sedimentologists, so I'll just do some sort of basic introduction. So a submarine canyon is a steep-sided valley, often described as a V-shaped valley, that indents the continental shelf, incisors the continental slope down here, often feeds a channel system or a channel levee system on the basin floor, then builds lobes to form what's called a deep sea fan. So submarine canyons are the main conduit for a lot of sediment that's shed from rivers and from the coast. And in this diagram, you see a river system feeding a delta, and the delta is quite close to the canyon head. Sometimes rivers intersect directly with the canyon head, an example being the Congo Canyon, West Africa. And sometimes rivers are quite disconnected from the canyon head. And where they're disconnected, sediment is moved by longshore drift until it intersects the canyon head and then fails down it. And that failure can happen either through just building of sediment mass on the flanks of the canyon until it fails for some reason. It could be a seismic trigger, or it could be a storm or something like that. But anyway, canyons are really important transport pathways for the transport of sediment and organic material. So the flows that go down them are very large. They transport huge volumes of organic material. There's been some really good papers on that from the Congo Canyon recently, and they show that the flows within single submarine canyons can sort of carry as much sediment, as much organic material as all the world's rivers in a single event in some cases. So the flows that make their way down these canyons are driven by gravity. So we've moved to the coast and river systems. You've got wind, you've got other things taking place. But the flows that go down these canyons are driven by gravity, things like turbidity currents and debris flows. I've just got a video of a turbidity current here, which I guess this is about 15 years old. It's from David Morrig's lab up at Pickle. And what you're going to see is this essentially a swimming pool. This is a ramp. It's filled with water, just fresh water. And this flow, which is generated here, is driven by the density excess of that flow. So there's sediment, in this case, I think it's probably silica flour mixed with water, creating the density excess and then creating this dense underflow. And in nature, these things are extremely mobile. They can run out for tens, hundreds, or maybe more kilometers on the seabed. They're very large, and they can overcome significant topography, and they create the largest sedimentary deposits on Earth, submarine fans. So that's what they look like. And when me and a colleague and I, Mike Clare at the National Oceanography Centre in the UK, started thinking about microplastics in the sea, this was before we did any real work. We did a literature review and just had a think about the different processes that might transport plastics to the seafloor. It's a very complicated, horrible diagram, but we made it, so it's here. So the same sort of diagram, submarine canyon. We've got gravity currents, turbidity currents, debris flows, building a submarine fan down here. That is the primary pathway for most of the sediment that's going down to the deep basins. So if there's microplastics there, they'll be going down there. Microplastics can also be carried in the air. There's quite a few studies that show their presence in clouds and in rainwater. So they can be carried out that way. They can derive from settling from surface plastics, so these big oceanic gyres, the Great Pacific Garbage Patches, things like that. It's different pathways. Once on the seafloor, there's other currents that are active, things like thermohaline currents, currents driven by temperature and salinity contrasts. They can then remobilize that plastic and move it around on the ocean floor. And we have ocean sources of plastic as well, things like industry, fishing, shipping, and then processes like bioturbation, so things that are eating the plastics on the seabed. So how do they reach the seafloor? So I think often when we think about plastics, you think of them as floating. But plastics span a really wide range of densities, from things that are quite a lot less dense than freshwater or seawater to things that are nearly as dense as minerals. So there's some plastics that are sort of nearly as dense as quartz, for example. Most aren't. Most are a little bit more dense than seawater, but around that sort of bracket. However, so if they're more dense than seawater, they'll sink. However, buoyancy, or the tendency to float, might change through time by various processes, densification processes, including biofouling, adsorption, and mineral precipitation. So that's biofouling, the development of a film on the surface. And this can drastically change the density of particles so that they sink. They can also degrade, so if there's cavities in the plastic air pockets that break down through UV degradation, they might then sink. Minerals can precipitate on the surface, and various other surface coatings can change the density of those particles. There's been a lot of work recently looking at the settling velocity of microplastics and how that changes through time with the growth of biofilms. I won't really go into this particularly, but that's a great reference to look at if you're interested in the settling of microplastics. And other ways that they sink, so we're thinking about individual particles at the moment, but of course they're often mixed with clay and silt and sticky stuff, so they can sink that way. But they might be incorporated into a car seat in that car that's at the bottom of the Var Canyon or whatever. And they're also eaten by things, so biological transport agents, so fish and various things that eat plastics and then die, sink, or they get eaten. So there's different ways that they can reach the seafloor. One of the key things I said is the growth of surface coatings, and there's a lot of active research on this at the moment. The growth of biofilms and then the tendency to enhance sorption. Things like metal ions and other organic pollutants can accumulate on those surfaces until they become quite toxic, nasty things. So that's a process that's reasonably well known. And I'll just put this in because this is some work I did with my colleague Mia Hughes. We made this applet for teaching purposes. So it's a really simple applet, it's free to use, and we've got one that's a jar as well. So we can adjust various parameters like particle density, diameter, and then grow a biofilm. So here we've got a 5mm diameter particle. We're growing this biofilm, and in that time this particle is floating out to sea. Then it can settle once it's reached the same density as seawater, and it settles down through the water column to the seabed. And this is a question I set for the undergraduate students, which particle would settle quicker, the small one or the big one, with the growth of the biofilm. So now we're going to try a 0.1mm diameter particle, grow a biofilm. It's not made it anywhere really, it's going to sink right next to the coast. And the reason why is those small particles have a much larger surface area. It's very rough anyway. They have a much larger surface area than larger particles, so it takes much less time for that biofilm to overcome that density contrast. But these applets are free to use, and we'd like people to use them for teaching or whatnot. Pretty simple, but there we go. What about denser microplastics, so things that are already dense? So we did some experiments at the University of Utrecht in a slightly dirty-looking flume tank. And what we did here was to run some gravity currents down a straight channel, like a two-dimensional channel, just to look at the behavior of fibers and fragments within a turbidity current. This is going to go by really quickly, but I can start it. There we go, that's the turbidity current flying by, carrying lots of plastic. What we did was to run this flow. It was full of sand and silt. The bed degrades beneath that current as it's ongoing, and then we knew the starting mix that we put in, and we sampled the bed to see what was happening in the bed. And sort of intuitively, in a way, before we did this work, Mike Clare and I made this conceptual diagram. This diagram shows on this axis the concentration and velocity profile of a turbidity current. So that's the seafloor basically there. That's height in the flow. This black line shows typical velocity profile of a turbidity current. So the velocity maximum is somewhere above the bed, about here, usually in a simple model about 20% of the bed flow thickness, which is partly why they're so mobile on complex slopes. So that's the velocity profile. Because of gravity, if we've got some coarse-grained dense particles, and here this grey line, they're going to be concentrated towards the base of the flow. Less dense particles are going to have a more homogeneous distribution through the flow. so low settling velocity to shear velocity. And conceptually, so this is the particles within the flow, lots of coarse grains, fragments, these blue things, and fibers. And we thought, and we wrote, that what we thought would happen would fragments would settle out first because of their shape, and the fibers, because they would behave hydrodynamically as lighter particles, would just shoot off down into the deep basin. It wasn't actually what happened in these experiments, and I think we know the reason why. But as the bed was growing beneath the turbidity current, we actually saw an enrichment of fibers in that layer compared to the fragments. So the fibers, we think, were being trapped by the grains that were coming out of suspension, and the fragments were landing on the bed, acting as an obstacle to the ongoing flow and just being picked up and carried and transported further down. So we actually saw the reverse of what we thought we would see. But one caveat with, so this is a PhD student, Florian Pohl, one caveat with his work was he had really long fibers. They were 5 millimeters long and the fragments were only about 1 millimeter across. So I think that probably needs a fresh set of eyes at some point. We also, a student who worked with me, Dan Bell, he did some experiments at Utrecht as well. This is a flume tank, much like the one at Pickle, a bit smaller. And he ran a large flow down a slope. And this was the starting mix of that flow: quartz sand, silt, clay, plastic, and some garnet. Particles of really wide range of density. We were interested in how provenance indicators might vary across a depositional fan. And just to jump straight forward to the results of that, he saw that the channel was basically, it was a bypass conduit through which everything shot through. The sands in there were relatively lacking in plastics, and the plastics accumulated no great shock in the more distal areas, so the distal fan, and in the levees on the channel margins. I mean, that's intuitive, but nobody had actually done this to test it, and this gives us something to think about when we start sampling the seabed. What environments are we sampling? And then just to jump to the very deep, so the deepest ocean trenches, so we're talking 10 kilometers deep or more, there's a lot of microplastics. And a lot of the models for this, or a lot of these observations have been made by oceanographers, shall we say, not sedimentologists, and their model is basically plastic floats around in these gyres, and then it settles down out of suspension, so there's a relatively uniform blanket of plastic across the seabed. And I don't buy that, because we know there's lots of currents that act on the seabed. But the interesting thing is, once they're in these really deep trenches, they're not going to go anywhere, because gravity will win when they're that deep down. So let's have a look at some of the work I actually did, not just stuff I didn't do. So we're going to look at Whittard Canyon, which is UK's major submarine canyon. It's just here. This is Manchester is just over here. That's where it came from. Liverpool's just there. And this continental shelf is extremely wide. So during the last glaciation, this was exposed. There's a major river system ran from the River Thames and the Rhine over here, all the way out here to the continental shelf edge. It's not there anymore, it's drowned, but we see its record on the seafloor. We see record of the archaeology of people that used to live here, all gone now. But what we have left is this drowned continental shelf edge with all of these canyons. And this is the Whittard submarine canyon here. So present day is not connected directly to a land source of sediment. Closest shoreline's over 300 kilometers away, but nevertheless it receives sediment through the action of currents which are operating on the continental shelf, moving sand across the shelf. We were quite surprised by just how active this system is. And with a student working with Mike and I, Martin Heinen, we monitored a series of, we monitored the canyon to measure the velocity of flows, if there were flows going down the canyon, to see what was going on. What we found was within 1 year period, there were 6 major turbidity currents in this canyon. When I say major, they were several meters per second. They were carrying sand aloft in suspension in flows tens of meters thick. They were fast. They were equivalent to canyons that are connected to rivers today. So it was really quite a surprise that they were so big. This is a velocity profile. Sorry, that's a velocity profile. This particular flow has 2 peaks. Echo intensity, which is basically a proxy for the concentration of the flow, if you like. And this flow is particularly interesting to us because we had a sediment trap suspended 10 meters above the bed of the canyon, and that sediment trap was totally filled in the very first part of the passage of one flow, which we didn't expect, and it's filled with medium-grained sand. So it's quite a big flow going through there. So we had this data, and then we also had a set of cores which were collected from the canyon axis and from the canyon flanks. So, and the two students who did most of the work on this, Peng Chen, he was on a placement from China for a year, did an amazing job, both as a student and as an individual. And Ed Keaveney, who's now doing a postdoc where he will be with Pete Talling in Durham. So just to jump to some of the results in a sort of back and forward way here. So the work of Peng Chen, this is the canyon axis, this is the eastern canyon arm. These circular charts show the concentration of plastics at individual points. We measure these in a slightly odd way. It's number of particles per 50 grams of dried sediment. It's the convention. It's not how I would have started it, but that's the existing convention. So sometimes it's too difficult to change these things, so we just went along with it. But the pink is microfibers, the blue is fragments. You'll see it's nearly entirely dominated by fibers. And these numbers, 82, 68, that's the number of particles per 50 grams of dried sediment. So it's quite a lot. The sediment trap was up here, ST. Just to show you what that looked like, that's the canyon margins. The ADCP is the acoustic Doppler current profiler. That's the thing that monitored, that's a downward-looking probe that measured the velocity of the flows running through the canyon, 30 meters above the bed, that was positioned. And the sediment trap just 10 meters above the bed, just here. And we found there's a large number of plastics in there compared to other canyons. It doesn't really matter the absolute numbers because each system is different, but there's a lot of plastic, and in particular the sediment trap had a lot of plastic in it. And I'll come back to that in a second. What he also did then was a series, these are the core locations, C1 to C7 going down here. Quite a lot of plastic down to, so these are 1 centimetre increments between each sample site. They generally decrease downwards, which you might expect with the production of plastic through time. But in the canyon axis, this is a really active zone. So you've got tides going up and down the canyon, turbidity currents. It's all been reworked, changing through time. So it's not really a record of anything other than the fact that there's some plastics in the canyon, really, at this point. The only thing that we noticed really was there seemed to be, the plastics were generally associated with the silt grain size fraction, so below 63 microns. We'll come back to the grain size. So some of the contextual information we collected was the grain size distribution of these cores, so C1 to C7, and then the sediment trap. So the sediment trap, sort of medium sand, really uniform distribution, which is really interesting from a sort of sedimentological point of view. So the turbidity current is very active in sorting the sediment it's carrying, but it's quite a bit coarser than everything else that we see in the canyon axis. Those grain sizes do exist, but what this implies to us is that there's a lot of bypass through this canyon. It's building a submarine fan beyond the canyon because we're not seeing this material so much within the axis. And that suggests a lot of plastic is going out to the much deeper sea. And if you're familiar with the Shields diagram, this is a diagram that shows the tendency or the shear stress required to move particles on the bed. And not surprisingly, we've made these calculations for a turbidity current running through this canyon. Not surprisingly, a turbidity current running through this canyon can pick up, initiate motion and initiate suspension of particles of all these sizes and all these plastic sizes. We use these diagrams to see whether things will be prone to being picked up and reworked or not. And if you put a big turbidity current down a canyon like this, it's no surprise it is going to remove everything, remobilize everything. But we'll compare that to what we see in another setting shortly. Right, and then so what Ed did was to then look at several transects across the canyon. So Peng Chen looked at down canyon, Ed looked at stuff across the canyon, and he had the benefit of some age control from one of these cores. So we had some age control, which is here, so accumulation rates of about 0.22 centimetres a year. This is high on the flanks, it's much finer grained, less active, if you like, but still accumulating at a reasonable rate. So this is probably all the muddy material that's sort of spilling outside of the canyon. The interesting thing is that the closest core to that age date shows there's a lot of plastic actually below the onset of mass production of plastic, which is about 1950. And by extrapolating, correlating the layers within the cores, it's not super accurate, but it looks like there's plastics just going down quite some distance, well below that 1950 timeline. So Ed hypothesized a number of reasons for that, and I'll come to that in a second, but to sort of summarize the processes that are active here, we've got cross-continental shelf currents. So these are the currents carrying the sand all the way across the shelf to the canyon head. And that's being flushed down the canyon. We're not sure why. We're not sure if it's big sort of sand bars that get to the edge and then just migrate over the edge and fall down it, or whether they're being remobilized by trawlers. So there's a lot of fishing activity here, or other events, storms, and so on. Some of the plastic is probably just settling through the water column, so stuff that's floating out and settling down. It's been moved down the axis by turbidity currents. Internal tides are really active here, so even at a few kilometers water depth, there's really strong internal tides driving up and down the canyon, tidal currents. That's because they're coming basically all the way across the Atlantic and they're hitting this slope, and they're being forced up the canyon. So the tidal currents are actually quite strong, even at considerable depths. And what Ed hypothesized was that this impingement of tidal currents and other currents on the sediment is driving a pressure gradient through the pore space, moving fluids up and down, essentially pumping up and down through the sediment. And we also saw lots of evidence of bioturbation, so burrows, so things living in the sediment that were drawing down plastics with them. It's kind of interesting, but quite a few authors have said plastics probably are the best mark of the onset of the Anthropocene, and this would suggest it was probably not really. All right, so this is a really quick visit to a submarine canyon. The other side of the planet, New Zealand. So the Kaikoura Canyon, this is New Zealand, this is Kaikoura Canyon, and it feeds the Hikurangi Channel over this way. There was a big earthquake there in 2016, Kaikoura earthquake. What this map shows is a difference map before and after this earthquake. So the earthquake epicenter was over here somewhere. Sediment the shelf basically was shook, collapsed down the canyon, and it eroded. That's the red colours, and it deposited. That's the blue colours in here. So it's a really big event. What was cool is we have a core from that place. This is one of my students, Zichu Zhang. She worked with Katie Meyer when she was based down there. This is a core, about 10 centimetres wide. That's about 35 centimetres thick. This is the background sedimentation. This is the earthquake turbidite. So that's a single turbidite that was deposited as a consequence of that. And the really cool thing is it's full of microplastics. Well, it's not cool, it's terrible. There's microplastics in there, but what's interesting is that it's also absolutely full of forams, these calcareous forams. And some of these are thousands of years old, and they're all mixed together because these were deposited on the shelf. It opens a lot of sort of interesting implications for things like biostratigraphy and so on. So you've got modern day plastics mixed with really ancient fossils, which I think is pretty cool. But terrible. Yeah. Another major process is thermohaline currents. So these are currents driven by temperature and salinity. Generally relatively, or thought of as being relatively weak and sluggish. Actually, it's probably not the case from lots of the new data that we see, but there's a large scale sort of ocean circulation. So we went to a place in Europe, so this is the Mediterranean Sea, an enclosed basin. This is Corsica, Sardinia, Italy, Sicily, and this basin here is called the Tyrrhenian Sea. Very difficult word to spell, Tyrrhenian, as we found out. And we went there because there's a lot of data available here. So this is the Mediterranean, and this is a map of the river inputs of plastic to the Mediterranean, coupled with a modelled bottom flux of plastic on the seabed. So where it's quite red, this is where models have predicted there's lots of plastic going to be present, not so much in the Tyrrhenian Sea. So there's a really good sort of contextual information on what was going into the Mediterranean. And so zooming in on this area, and the other thing we wanted was sediment cores. And the sediment cores in this case were associated with, just go back, a seafloor infrastructure, so telecommunications cables going from sort of North Africa over to Sardinia and then over to Italy. And as these were being installed, there's lots of site investigation, and part of that was collecting cores which were available to us for investigation. So, seafloor map, you've got the land in green, pink is the continental shelf, so relatively shallow, up to about 100 meters, maybe a bit more in places. Then the continental slope in white, then the deeper basin here, which is about just over a kilometre deep. Quite a complicated topography on the basin floor, and that topography is a series of ridges which are bedrock. It's called the Messinian surface. And that bedrock is then draped by what's called drift deposits, silty deposits moved by thermohaline flows, sometimes called bottom currents or contour currents, but generally the same thing. So we had a series of cores going from the shelf edge next to this canyon, down the slope to the basin floor and around this complicated topography. The white lines show the deep ocean current flow directions. The yellow line shows the longshore drift on the shelf. Oh, if we look at where x to x prime is, we're going to look at a cross-section from x to x prime. So this is a seismic line, and it shows really nicely. This is the Messinian surface. This is hard bedrock. It's tilted and folded and forms this really rugose relief. And these really nice sort of parallel reflections are thin-bedded siltstone, predominantly siltstone deposits. These are called drift deposits. And this is the grain size transported by these currents on the seafloor, deposited against that bedrock topography. So another thing we wanted was box cores, because box cores don't disturb the sediment surface, as you can see by this starfish, still sat happily there, not so happy anymore. The colour change shows the oxidation of the sediment with depth. And then one of the problems with a lot of this data is a lot of core is collected and stored in plastic tubes. So we have to mitigate against that by sampling these plastics and analysing them together with our samples. And again, jump to results. There's lots of plastics found in this contrite drift deposit, more than we'd seen elsewhere. The relative abundance away from shore, so simple models just said there'd be less plastic as you get away from the shore. It's not what we see, and that's because they're concentrated by these flows. And they seem to occupy a certain depth, but I'd say there's a reasonably wide spread of depths that they occur at. And the highest numbers we saw tended to be in these drift deposits, this bottom current deposits. So, but this was one of the first studies that really brought in the sedimentology to show how these things were actually moved on the seabed. One of the nice bits of data we had was this. So this is a modelled bed shear stress, and this is calibrated to a sensor we had on the seabed. So we're pretty confident in these results, and you can see the flow of these currents, quite complicated around the basin. It's difficult to really relate the plastic numbers to the bed shear stress, but there's probably a relationship there if you took more samples than we did. And again, if we look at another Shields diagram, you now see that the strength of the flows is much reduced compared to those turbidity currents, and the particles are generally at or near being stuck on the bed or being able to be mobilised. So, quick look at some other types of pollutants. This is quite a quick look. So there's lots of organic pollutants, lots of other pollutants in the deep sea which are interested and they accumulate in biota and or can be absorbed onto particles. So in Monterey Canyon, for example, there's a really nice study, or there's a few studies actually, looking at DDT, which is a banned pesticide, banned in the 70s, but it still resides in the soil, it still makes its way to the coast, and it still is transported in turbidity currents down to the deeper basin. That's what this diagram shows, this Monterey Canyon. DDT load down here, and what was documented here is a sedimentologically controlled distribution of DDT on the seafloor, with the finer DDT preferentially carried with fine-grained sediment settling out on levees and on the deeper fan. Similarly, very high levels of organic pollutants in the deep trenches, and again, it's been suggested this stuff just rains out from the sea surface to the sea floor, and that's it. I don't buy that. As I said before, with the microplastics, it's probably much more controlled by flow processes. And we see lots of nasty PCBs sorbed to microplastics transported a really long way on the sediment surface. One of the interesting ones that's got a lot of attention recently is PFAS, or so-called forever chemicals. There's now thought to be maybe 20,000 or so different types. Most of them aren't regulated, not even known to much of the world. Some of them undoubtedly as nasty or more nasty than the banned types. So there's a lot of it out there. And these are generally surface coatings used in things like pans, but also in waterproof clothing, in paper and paint, absolutely everywhere. And they're really, what makes them forever chemicals is this bond between carbon and fluorine. It's an incredibly strong bond. And the long chain PFAS that have more of these bonds are really resistant to breakdown. So they last way beyond our lifespans. So they're quite nasty. They're particularly hazardous, lots of implications for health of humans and otherwise. Interestingly, they can stick to sediments. So they can absorb onto sediments and organic matter, and they can partition into organic carbon. And that means, just like plastics, they can be transported in ways that we understand. And there's been one particular, well, only one study that I know of, there may be some more coming soon, the study by Sanchez Vidal. And what they did was to sample what they called dense shelf water cascades in the Cap de Cruz Canyon over here, and they found PFAS were being carried by turbidity currents. They sampled turbidity currents directly, and they found that these long chain, the really nasty, hard to break down things, were affiliated with coarser grains, quartz grains, whereas the short chain ones had an affinity to silt size or clay size particles. So we might anticipate that they have quite a wide distribution on the seafloor, whereas the long chain ones may be more concentrated in canyons and channels, which is exactly where things like to live. So we've got a proposal to try and look at this in a range of different canyon settings, from river connected to disconnected. We're just waiting for the successful funding application to come through. So, to summarise, you didn't get the first canyon, which is the Monterey Canyon. Does anyone know this one? What's it called? It's got a name that you don't want to say in public anyway, that's why I put it there. Juan de Fuca. So, most studies of oceanic pollution don't consider sedimentological processes. This is a huge gap, and it's quite basic stuff. Without sedimentology, we can't understand the processes, we can't be predictive, and we can't compare results across environments, we can't monitor mitigation efforts. Building, I hate this sort of arm-wavy stuff, but building a community response is absolutely vital, because the problem is there's a few of us doing this sort of work, but it's like a foreign language to ecologists, to biologists, to chemists. They don't understand why it's important, and that's why we need more people doing it, I think. And that's it, some references for you.